Hello everybody, and welcome to another video. Photography. It's something I've never touched upon on the channel, not once in its entire 5-year history. But it's something that has been a hobby for most of my life. If you were to look at this photo album right here, you'd see what are some of the very first pictures I ever took. Now, I've been taking pictures, like I said, for most of my life, but unlike the pictures I took in this book, most of them were in a digital format, be it on things like my Nintendo DS or a cheap digital camera that I used to own. These pictures are on film. Now, I took those pictures in that book on a cheap disposable camera. But what about real film photography?
Well, that's exactly what today's video is going to be all about, but more specifically, 35mm film. Now, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive guide or even a collection of advice on how to shoot on film, because there's far more people who are better qualified to talk about that kind of stuff available right here on YouTube, on dedicated channels or singular videos. And in fact, I've only been shooting on film for just under a year. I've only maybe shot 6 or 7 rolls in total on 2 different cameras. The first of which being this, a 1983 Minolta X570. It's an SLR that I picked up off of someone through Kijiji when I started. I bought it for $20 along with 2 other lenses and a flash unit. The second camera being this, a 1961 Canon Canonette. I bought this for $15 last month. It's not an SLR, in fact it's a rangefinder, meaning you don't see through the same lens that the camera takes pictures through. You see through a viewfinder with a rangefinder built in, which is a sort of focusing window built from 2 different squares that you bring into focus by adjusting them until 2 pictures become 1. And of course, being vintage cameras, they both come with their fair share of issues. The Minolta doesn't have any major ones, just a shutter that occasionally sticks open longer than it should, and it often cuts off the left half of the frame. The Canonette, however, is an entirely different story. This camera's shutter is permanently stuck. That is, unless you take apart the lens in its entirety and manually unstick the shutter, in which case you've got about an hour to shoot pictures through it until it gets stuck again. Now, in case that wasn't enough, when I opened up the camera, being inexperienced as I am, I didn't go for the lens right away. I took apart the top half of the camera and opened up the viewing window. Now, I figured, it's old, I could probably do with cleaning it. Well, that didn't go well. I ended up cleaning the actual part of the rangefinder that allows you to see the focusing squares, meaning that focusing on this camera is a complete guess. You cannot see the focusing squares anymore, so it's impossible to tell if you're in focus when taking a picture, which makes things pretty difficult. Now, despite the issues that these 2 cameras have, I've shot 6 or 7 rolls in total, most of them being through the Minolta, and so far only 1 being through the Canon. Now, of course, I'm not going to show you every single picture I've taken on film, but I thought I'd show you what I thought were the highlights from each roll. So, without further ado, here we go. Well, this is it. The very first picture I ever took on 35mm film. A slightly out of focus self-portrait with my very blurry brother in the background. Now, at the time I was completely new to both 35mm film and the camera I was using, so it's no wonder that the shutter speed is a bit too slow, hence my very blurry brother. And, of course, as you can tell, the exposure is just a little too low, so things are lacking detail in the shadows. And, on top of that, the focus is completely off. The background is in better focus than I am, which is something a lot of my portraits have in common. One of the best pictures by far on the first roll I took is this one of my dad sitting in the front seat of his truck. What makes it better than a lot of the other ones on this roll is that all of the main subjects are fully in focus, being my dad and dashboard. I really like the nice vibrant colors in this one and the contrast between the inside of the truck and the outside. However, if I were to take this picture again, I think I'd lower the exposure just a tad, because everything outside of the car is basically so washed out that there's almost no detail on it. So I think a slightly lower exposure would benefit this picture some. This portrait of my mother shows off one of the few issues that the Minolta has, that being when it cuts off the left half of the frame, as I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, it's actually a very good picture. It's in perfect focus regarding the main subject of the photo, and the depth of field is quite nice. The background being nice and blurred, while the front subject of my mother being very nice, very sharp, and framed very well too. It's directly in the center of the frame. It's a very simple shot, but a very nice one. The colors in this picture are also one of its highlights. There's nice different contrasts between the darkness of her clothes and some of the lighter greens and things in the background of the shot. I think honestly the cutoff on the left makes it a much more interesting picture. Without it, it wouldn't be all that different from any other portrait. That's kind of what sets it apart. Overall, good picture. Not to be overly boastful, but this roll is really where I began to shine. And nowhere does that come across better than in some shots like this one. As you can see from shots like this, I really did look at the first roll and observe some of the mistakes that I made, and clearly I did learn from them. I improved upon things like my iffy depth of field and my lack of focus on close subjects. The mailbox is in very nice focus on its farther left side, where you can see the Canada Post logo and things. Meanwhile, the background and far foreground of the mailbox are completely obscured, making it a very, very neat looking macro shot. But just because I improved does not mean I became perfect all of a sudden, and that's very clear in pictures like this one of my sister, in which case it is very sharp, but it's incredibly underexposed, and that's incredibly important when taking a picture. Exposure is what allows you to be able to see detail in your pictures. If you over or underexpose a picture too much, then they lack detail, and you can certainly see that in this one. Now, the pond is one of my absolute favorite pictures I've taken. Something about the way the snow-covered bushes wrap around the corners and edges of the frame, and the lines of houses fading into the distance. It's just a really nice, very classic looking picture, something I can totally see being on a Christmas card or something the like. Just a really nice picture. Ravenscroft really displays how great of a photo opportunity Canadian winters can be sometimes, cold as they are. They look really nice. And the snow on the ground and the fog in the distance really is what makes this picture look great. And there's just a kind of nice charm to it all. There's not much to say about it, it's just a decent photo. Well, it doesn't have a title, but it does have leaves. Untitled number 11 is just a really nice macro shot, a display of what the lens on the Minolta is capable of. This, I believe, is a 50mm lens. Now, it doesn't have any zoom capabilities, but as displayed in this shot, can have really, really nice macro shots and is a very sharp, very nice lens, which makes me all the more glad that I have it. This one, however, wasn't shot on that 50mm lens and still looks great. It was shot on one of the other two lenses that came with my camera, a mid-range about this large zoom lens. Now, this is one of my favorite photos on this particular roll, shot on Portra 160 from Kodak. It just shows some electrical towers just kind of lining off into the distance. I also like how in this one you could never tell how many towers there are. Who knows how many there are? It could be forever. They might end right after they go into the fog. No one knows, and I like that. It's a cool looking picture. I might not have pack film to use it with since it isn't made anymore, but man am I glad I own the Polaroid 340. Just look at this thing. It's such an interesting looking rangefinder, and it doesn't operate like most other rangefinders. Instead of twisting a lens, you move the lens forwards and back. It's just an eye-catching camera, especially with its flashbulb unit mounted on top, which I don't have here with me, but is visible in the picture. On top of the fact that it's a good-looking camera, mine just happens to be in near mint condition, which makes it great as a movie prop or a prop for photos. There's one thing that makes this picture as eye-catching as it is, and that's contrast. The way that the red roof pops against the cold white snow and the dark green trees in the background. That's what makes it so appealing to look at. And I'm really glad I took it because that makes a good wallpaper. Now, nearly every shot in this roll was hockey themed, and since I hadn't figured out how shutter speed worked at that point, as you can imagine, pretty much every single one of them is just a blurry gray blur. Except this picture of my brother, which, other than his moving hand, is in perfect focus, because he wasn't moving very much. Hence why it came out pretty good. It's actually the only portrait of my younger brother I've taken on film thus far, which, I mean, makes it special to me at least. It's actually pretty nicely framed. If only the shutter speed was a little bit quicker, because then maybe his hand wouldn't be so blurred. And here's the only other good hockey shot, which only came out so good because luckily everyone was standing still enough for there to be no motion blur at all. Another self-portrait, but hey, this time I'm actually in focus along with the background. I actually really like the framing of this one because I'm dead center, but not right up against the camera. I'm pushed a little bit further back. The other reason I like this photo quite a bit is because of where I'm sitting. It's very difficult to place an exact location or time period in the picture, which I like that. Just wish I was wearing something different though. It's not really quite my style. I find it a little strange that I never took another train-related picture on 35 before this, because I've always had a bit of a fascination with trains and locomotives and things ever since I was a little kid. So it's a little odd that the two hobbies didn't really cross over until this. And I even only live a few blocks away from some rail lines these days, which makes it even stranger. Anyway, I like the depth of field in this shot. Not much to explain, just look at it. Wow. Just wow. Look at those clouds. I don't need to say anything else. There's a lot of things that make this shot great. The fact that Alex is completely consumed by the shadows in the background, and the fact that you can kind of just barely spot me in the reflection of the glass, or even the fact that it's titled right behind you when Alex is clearly in front of you at the camera. Arg! The Minolta's frame clipping strikes again. Although this is the first time that the area that got cut off wasn't entirely opaque. It's actually kind of see-through here, which is interesting. Although I still have no idea what causes it. There it is, quite possibly my favorite of any of the pictures I've taken on 35mm thus far. The composure of this shot is just immaculate. The contrast between the different shades of gray on the wall and cement, and the dark blue of the windows popping against the light blue of my brother's shirt, and obviously just the unlimited amount of coolness that radiates off of him. This is my crowning achievement in the field of photography as far as I'm concerned. Spokes and Sprockets is a combination of two of my biggest hobbies, vintage bicycles and photography. The reason I took this picture is, one, I like the bike in the picture, and two, it had just rained and I wanted to try taking a bit of a more macro shot with some rain on it, and I think it looks pretty nice on the handlebars. It's a very sharp picture too, which adds to its appeal. I'm pretty sure this is the biggest landscape I've captured on film so far. Greenwood Park is an insanely vast area, and the only reason I was able to get a shot like this is because of a very conveniently placed hill I had climbed to get up there and get a view like that. Piece of advice though, try to avoid hiking with a bicycle if you can. This roll was a big experiment. It was shot on a film I was unfamiliar with, which is Fuji Color Superia 400, and on a very unreliable camera. Well, it was also an experiment in one other way. most of the rolls I shot beforehand were things like landscapes or items or people who knew I was photographing them. In this roll, I wanted to go for more candid shots of people just being them in their day-to-day lives, which is pretty apparent in a lot of the shots that are here, like this one, for example, of two people on the bus. It's a very natural looking shot, but of course its biggest drawback is exposure, which I hadn't quite figured out properly even then. Exposure was something I was still tooling around a little bit here and there, and I hadn't quite figured out how to do exposure properly on the Canonette, hence why a lot of the pictures look the way they do. Housing complexes like these often remind me of Soviet-era Russia, or other areas in the USSR, which is often referred to as the Eastern or East Bloc, hence the name of this picture, since I'm further west, as I live in Canada, not Russia. But the thing is, if you were to go east far enough from Russia, you'd end up here again. So then, which way is more east? I just found this sign funny. There's really no other reason as to why this picture exists. Although, to talk about the picture itself, I like the framing, however, it's really underexposed, but I think it works in this photo's favor because the overly dramatic lighting only makes the sign of a huge egg much funnier. This is another picture that is really hard to place time period wise, and that comes from multiple elements of it. The weird fluorescent lighting that stores like Value Village have, the person in the foreground wearing bell-bottom jeans, and the fact that there's no clear indicators of time period. Things like certain technologies like cell phones or advertisements and things, and since you've got contradicting fashion styles, it makes it difficult to place it. This photo really could take place almost any time within the last 4 or 5 decades, and I think that makes it kind of neat. This is probably the closest I've ever gotten to photographing something that felt like a liminal space. It feels strangely familiar, but at the same time oddly foreign. There's something weirdly unnerving about the picture, in my opinion, but the thing can't be placed. That's a little bit weird, isn't it? Well, that's all the pictures I have to show you today, and I think they're pretty good showcases of where I am at my ability in photographing on film at the moment. Now, it's been a rocky road that's, cost me a decent bit of money, but I've really enjoyed the hobby so far, and it's something I'm definitely going to pursue into the future. Though I'd like to do other things like learn how to develop film at home, or try and get my own flatbed scanner so that I can save a bit of money in photo processing and do that kind of stuff independently. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble about my escapades in the world of film for the last however many minutes. It's not a super interesting topic, and it's also something I've never covered on the channel before whatsoever, so even though my channel doesn't really have a theme, this is kind of out of the blue. But as always, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.